We will have the conversations that few are prepared to have, and more importantly, conversations centered on rationality. Subscribe now to listen to Rational Voices with Sunil. Dennis, great to meet you. How are you?
I'm not bad for an old bloke, mate. I hope you're very well.
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. How's your day been?
Yeah, busy, lawyering and so on. Busy, entertaining, not bad. How's yours?
Nice. Yeah, no, it's okay. It's okay. I mean, I was reading up before this podcast on some of the work you've been doing, and you're very active for people who are not aware on your social media and in general in media in general and TV and stuff. So for people who are unaware of who you are and what you've done, it'd be great to get a bit of a background.
Sure. My name's Dennis Kavanagh. I'm a barrister by training. Crime is my background, and for most of my life, that's what I did. I was just a criminal barrister. Around the time of lockdown, became very alarmed, frankly, by what was going on in gender, particularly what it was doing to the gay rights movement. I'm a gay man, and a lot of us had sort of taken our eye off Stonewall, which turned out to be an error. And when we looked at it, we were all pretty horrified. So in the wake of that, in my early 40s, decided to become a sort of latter-day gay rights activist, really just looking in particular at the threat that gender ideology was posing to gay men and to lesbians, and sort of went from there. Since that time, I obviously still speak about that issue. I just say the same thing again and again. So no, that's all I do in this debate. But I also speak these days on things like proposals to get rid of the right to trial by jury, and sort
Right.
of more generally those sorts of things. So in a nutshell, that's who I am, a sort of gobby social media gay bloke.
I mean, it's fascinating because it's something that you very rarely will see or people will talk about is gay people and how they feel about LGBTQ plus or the whole trans bit because it's just associated as everyone agrees, everyone on that. But it's speaking to yourself and just reading about some of the articles you've done and some of the stuff you post on social media, it seems that's far from the case. Why is the what's going on or what's happened over the last few years, in particular with trans and gender ideology, why does that affect gay people?
Well, it affects gay people in a number of respects. Principally, the most alarming thing that it does, I can put very simply, which is that it teaches prepubescent or pubescent lesbians, or boys that will grow up to be gay men, that there is something wrong with them and that they need to be fixed. Now, any gay man, any lesbian has had a feeling that there is something wrong with them. And what we see in the evidence, I'm afraid, is that so-called gender-affirming care, which is an Orwellian euphemism, is disproportionately visited on that cohort. And we know that because of facts such as the 2012 Tavistock patient survey, and that proved incontrovertibly that 80% of the boys and 90% of the girls were same-sex attracted, and they were being told they had the wrong bodies. And it's worth asking yourself, well, the wrong bodies for what? And it turns out when you get that level of, gay boys and young lesbians, it's the wrong body for heterosexual sex. It's a new form of gay conversion therapy. I am adamantly convinced of that. And I make this simple argument. If trans was naturally occurring across the population, gay people are, I don't know, 1.5, 2, maybe even 3% of the population. Probably not that many. There's actually not that many of us. We all know each other. Really, the figures we should have seen in the 2012 patient survey should have been the same, right? Because if it's naturally occurring across cohorts, that should be the situation. But it is not. It is disproportionately the same-sex attracted who think there's something wrong with their bodies. And then when one looks deeper into that, I would remark in passing, you see a desperate overrepresentation of autistic children, 30-40% in some places. You see a desperate overrepresentation of kids with comorbidities and kids in care. So that is, to answer your question directly, that certainly was my principal concern. But beyond that, trans, I'm afraid, the modern form of trans, I emphasise, not what's sometimes called the old school transsexual, although there's some disputes about whether that was as benign as the phenomenon is sometimes presented as. But the modern gender ideological movement has entirely consumed all of the legacy gay rights organisations. There's a very interesting and telling study that says if you look at the incidences of the words gay men and lesbian in the Stonewall annual reports year after year, and you go from about 2015, you can see trans goes up like that.
Yeah.
Gay men does pretty badly and goes like that, but lesbian just drops off a cliff. I mean,
Wow.
it is the love that dare not speak its name. And I should say, I'm conscious, I do this interview as a gay man. It's lesbians who I think have been probably the hardest hit by this. But it's a direct challenge, I'm afraid, to gay people. And I suppose my third and final point would be this: it's gender ideology under the guise of the Scottish government in the Supreme Court, in the case of 4 Women Scotland against the Scottish ministers, that made the case to the Supreme Court that the homosexuality protected characteristic, that's the same-sex orientation protected characteristic in the Equality Act, should not exist. And the law lords said that if we went with the Scottish government, it would be rendered meaningless. Because as the lesbian interveners said, their case was that effectively the homosexuals were attracted to pieces of paper. So, someone who's got a gender recognition certificate. Now that is an existential challenge to homosexuality, because as J.K. Rowling very wisely said, without sex in law, there's no same-sex attraction. You don't have one. One is the building block for the other. So the challenge of the gender ideological movement, which I sometimes call political transvestitism, but whatever one calls it, is this. It wants to replace sex in law with gender identity, this sort of ephemeral soul-like concept, which is hugely problematic and hugely religious. Well, if you do that, and you say people are attracted to gender identities, what you do in law is you deny bodily attraction. And if you do that, then, for example, you have 2 kinds of gay men. You have the gay men who are male and the gay men who are female. Stop me if this sounds like Alice in Wonderland, but that's what happens. If you do that, gay men can no longer claim direct discrimination on the basis that they are men attracted to men, because they are now a subset of what the law considers to be gay men. Stop me if this is getting insane. But it has enormous ramifications. It sets back gay rights eons. So those are, I suppose, my sort of 3 greatest hits on the challenge to gay men and lesbians. And just to summarise those, our organisations have been consumed and dominated by something that's adverse to
Yep.
us. Young gay boys or gay teenage males and lesbians have been told they've got the wrong body. They've been chemically castrated, sometimes physically castrated. I believe it's gay conversion. And then finally, there's the destruction of our status in law. So that's why I see it as a challenge to us. I think it may be
Yeah.
a very big challenge to us.
When did you notice this sort of madness occurring? Because obviously it has been talked about quite a bit. But when were you, A, I suppose, when did you first notice this happening? And B, when did you start to think, wow, this is actually a serious threat to gay rights?
Yeah, it's good that you posed the question in 2 phases, because I certainly noticed it in 2 phases. I had an inkling that something was wrong during the first Trump presidency. During that time, Julie Bindel and a set of Milo Yiannopoulos, back when he was a gay man, were doing campus tours in the United States, and it was the begin. It's the sort of thing that Charlie Kirk, God rest his soul, does, right? But or used to do. And they were beginning to get cancelled. And I began thinking at that stage, Milo's a bit of a provocateur, of course. But I thought, well, cancelling Julie's a bit much, because Julie back in the day was talking about prostitution, which I was very interested in, because I was prosecuting quite a lot of cases about that sort of thing. Trafficking was what I was dealing with. So I always followed Julie's work, and I have huge admiration for her. So I noticed they started to get cancelled. Then Suzanne Moore who I regard as eminently sound, in The Guardian, as she was then, before she was handed out of it, started to get cancelled. And I thought, well, hang on a minute. Something's going wrong. And they were getting cancelled at the behest of trans rights activists. Then lockdown happened, or sometime after that lockdown happened, because I was just off being a barrister and thinking it's nice not being, it's quite nice not being the professional gay man and just being Dennis, but that wasn't to last, it would seem. And in lockdown, I started watching videos, and if you haven't watched them, I highly recommend them, of an extremely articulate, persuasive woman who's sadly not with us anymore, called Magdalene Burns, who is
Okay.
an intellectual and a woman skilled in rhetoric and reason like no one you've ever seen. And she was one of the founders of For Women Scotland. And she was sounding the alarm early because she was looking at trans activists and Stonewall in the direction. And I remember one of the videos where she a trans activist who's a man who says he's a woman, and he was basically beginning to start this process saying, well, genital preferences among homosexuals are transphobic. And she was saying, well, hang on a minute. That means that you are basically saying that homosexuality is immoral, and we've heard this all before. We've heard this, we are used to this. We've heard this once before. So it was that alerted me to it and got me onto the scent, really. And then when she started talking about Stonewall, to my now great shame, I think at the time I had a direct debit to Stonewall, and I wasn't really watching what they were doing, which I, endlessly regret and apologize for. And when I looked at what Stonewall were doing, I was frankly horrified. I would come to learn in due course Ruth Hunt sat in front of a group of parents, I think it was, and just lied to them at the height of the trans insanity. And she said, there's a video, she said, half of children who are not given puberty blockers will commit suicide. And it virtually elicited a gasp from the audience. It is a lie. That is a lie. That was a wicked lie for Baroness Hunt to tell. If Baroness Hunt is watching this, and which she probably isn't, but I've said this online before, my lady, you are free to sue me for defamation. I have called you a liar. I say that you are lying when you said half of children will kill themselves. It was a wicked lie. I don't know where she got it from. But it's precisely the sort of poison now that, leaves parents absolutely terrified with, God forbid, if a child who spent too much time on the internet says, Mum, Dad, I've got the wrong body. So that's broadly how I got into it. And then one thing, after another happened, and they started to become quite politically active and politically ambitious. They started to agitate for a conversion therapy ban, which sounds great, sounds like the sort of thing a gay man should be all in favor of. But actually, if you look into the detail, what they were saying is doctors need to accept the self-diagnosis of a 12, 13-year-old who's, someone not old enough to get a tattoo, who says, I've got the wrong body, you need to chemically castrate me and render me infertile and render me a lifelong medical patient. And if you don't, the doctor is guilty of conversion therapy against my gender identity. Now, the Boris Johnson government was considering doing that and did a public consultation. And that's when we formed Gay Men's Network, because we just said, right, what we need now is a particular sort of voice that is appropriate to responding to a legislative consultation that can speak from the ground as to, look, here's a bunch of gay men and friends at that time. We've always had friends, who are not gay men, to say, actually, the devil is in the detail here, and you've got to be really careful with this legislation, and you have to take a step back and say, these people are asking you to criminalize doctors in the field of child psychiatry. Does that sound normal to you? And when you put it that way, most people get it,
Definitely. I think most people, when you explain it like that, will definitely get it. And I suppose it's a good time to talk about the Gays Men's Network. I mean, how did that come about? Was that purely from the legislation? Is it still something that you're involved with now?
Yeah, still involved now. I'm very optimistic about what has happened in terms of gender and in terms of the fight and in terms of the seismic victory for Women Scotland ably obtained in the Supreme Court, because the central conceit of trans activism is trying, as I say, to try to replace sex with gender identity. 4 Women Scotland comprehensively have rendered, they're in total disarray, trans activists now, I think. That has ended. No political party is interested in it. So yeah, Gay Men's Network, we do policy papers, we do a lot of background work. So yes, we're still there. There is less to respond to now and less for us to do, I think, than was once the case. But the government are proposing to resuscitate this conversion legislation. So we're certainly going to stick around for that. There are a few other bits and pieces happening in the NHS in this area, which has been one of our primary concerns that we're prepared to stick around for. But we're not stonewalls, so no, I don't think we've all got jobs, right? We only did this because we thought it was an emergency. I don't know. I'll talk to the lads. I'm not sure all of us see us doing this for the rest of our lives. We were reluctant gay activists who came in because we saw what we thought was what we all believe is gay conversion therapy going on at the Tavistock. We'd like to get back to our lives at some point, But yeah, we're still around for the time being, and we still have meetings and talk to people and that sort of thing.
Do you think the overall, maybe just broadly, the sort of LGBTQ plus movement has overall been more negative for gay and lesbian rights? Because I think I think there's a lot of people who don't necessarily understand the differences and they group them all together. So I've started to think in maybe the last few months, we've had lots of people, some of the ones you've mentioned, Julie Bindel,
Yeah.
and Helen Joyce, and these people on the podcast. And the more I speak to them and other people, it has made me change my opinion on that movement in particular, because it just feels as if it's really damaged gay people and lesbians. What's your thoughts on it?
Well, you're correct, and the evidence bears you out. If you look at support for gay marriage in America, for example, it's nosediving. This movement's been absolutely toxic because this movement is inherently bullying. It has, I think, authoritarian tendencies. It tells people what to think and what language to use, and if they don't use it, they're assiduously cancelled. It also demonstrates it at its philosophical core, insofar as it has one. It's fundamentally homophobic for a start, because it calls gay men genital fetishists. It calls Nancy Kelly, the former chair of Stonewall, said women that only sleep with women, what you and I would call lesbians, right? She said they were sexual racists for not sleeping with men. That's how mad postmodernism can bring you. It's been tremendously damaging. It's made us look like bullies. It's made us look brittle. It is a disaster philosophically. Its only prospectus for gay men and lesbians is to tell everyone how much everyone hates them and hate crimes going up and all of this. It's a very grim prospectus. It's only really interested in trans politics. That's the only thing that it talks about. Your average Joe looks at it and says, what on earth are these people doing?
Yeah.
It does things which are hugely provocative and unpopular. When you and I grew up, drag queens weren't reading to kids in libraries. Why aren't they reading to, and you could, exactly what's going to follow from that. Why aren't they reading to old people? Why are they doing that? And drag is a Trojan horse, of course, just to normalize cross-dressing men. And it's also a way of reducing gay men to sort of stereotypes and clowns. So it's quite
Definitely.
1970s. But the challenge of this movement, it goes far beyond that, though. It challenges basic epistemology, because it says any form of knowledge is impossible. It's a ghastly, grotesque postmodern monster. The only truth that it says that's worth knowing is the truth that someone tells you. It says there is no objective truth. It says there is no definition of woman. There is no definition of lesbian. This, I'm afraid, is fundamentally empty as and unedifying as philosophical fruit. And in reality, it's just repackaged consumerism. All it's saying really is that people can do whatever the hell they want, and
Yeah.
you're not allowed to object to it. And if you do, you're a bigot. But it's no more philosophically complex than consumerism. The customer is always right in this form of politics, but it's been a disaster. It's been an
Yep.
absolute disaster. It's made us look stupid. Stonewall's in freefall. Stonewall used to enjoy the sort of access other charities would kill for governmentally. It used to be taken seriously. It was all but part of the shadow state. It was a trusted piece of shadow government.
Yep.
Everyone liked it. But now it's a pariah. No one who's serious in politics wants anything to do with it. So it's been a disaster. We've been absolutely betrayed. We've been deserted. And this is the problem with gender ideology. Helen Joyce makes this point. It doesn't just pervert organizations a little bit away from their objective, it inverts them. So
Definitely.
just as some feminist organizations are horrible to women, gay rights organizations have become homophobic because they support what is modern gay conversion therapy. They never take lesbian, definitely never take lesbian concerns seriously. They're not that interested in gay men like me. Stonewall have me blocked on Twitter. I think they're one of my earliest blocks. I'm rather proud of that, actually. So I
I
was
mean,
blocked back when they had the old logo.
it's crazy because like I didn't realize the amount of gay people that had that were that thought of that trans LGBTQ movement so negative. I had no idea. Maybe up until maybe a couple of years ago, and now the more I speak to people or meet people, I've struggled to find any gay people that are supportive of that organization or even included as part of this. Always tends to be straight people or
Yeah.
trans. I don't see any gay people, and just on the very basic level, there's some direct contradictions between all those groups as a group. How can you just group them as one and think that
Yeah.
they all have the same issue? It's absurd. So it's really interesting because the more I've spoken to people like yourself or just general everyday people, I think most people just don't understand the how you can group these completely different philosophies
I
and
agree. We're completely irreconcilable, right? Because you could describe transactivism as saying that they basically want sort of authoritarian state-enforced bisexuality, because they say, for example, there should be no such thing as sex by deception. They say you have no right to know what's in, the underwear, as it were, of someone you're on a date with, and everyone should just be okay with that. And people are attracted to gender identities and genders. They're not attracted to physical bodies. Well, I don't know if they've ever been to a pornography website, but you won't find a category for big gender identities. This is not how humans work. And I can tell you, coming from a community that is pretty well known for its appetite in this regard, the configuration of a human body matters desperately to gay men. It matters to everyone, right? It matters to everyone. So they're never going to reconcile, to be serious for a moment, their suggestion that, gay men are fine sleeping with women, or lesbians actually don't mind sleeping with men if they say they're women. They're never going to reconcile that with the foundational principle of our liberation movement, which is that we are attracted to our own sex. You can't reconcile those two things. You just can't, and I've called it transactivism. I should emphasise, there are plenty of people who identify as the other sex. I think, Blair White probably deserves a mention here, and there are sensible trans voices who say, this has got silly and a bit ridiculous. But in the heat of this battle, this got very nasty, this stuff, and it was very clear that some of the worst homophobic abuse I've ever had has been in the midst of the gender wars, where
right.
we're called AIDS monkeys. That's one thing we get called sometimes.
On trans actors, sorry.
Yeah, from trans activists, and that's an important distinction actually. Quite often it's people who aren't trans at all, isn't it? So I don't want to tar everyone with the same brush, but also there are some trans people who've called us that as well. But the fundamental point, though, is that we have irreconcilable and often competing political objectives. We have no political objectives, in my view, in common beyond communal garden liberation protected characteristic claims. All right? I don't believe in, quote, trans child healthcare because I believe the trans child is a political creation and not a medical creation.
Yeah.
And I believe the grotesque overrepresentation of gay people tells you that it is gay conversion therapy. And that means I will never be able to share a political objective that we should just accept the self-diagnoses of children who know nothing, children who've never obviously experienced, inorgasmic children, children who've never experienced sex, children who've never experienced fertility, children, as I say, children who couldn't get tattoos, and set them down that path. Our objectives are irreconcilable, I
Wh-
think.
When did it become apparent for you to like speak up publicly on this? Like, when did it become to you that like enough is enough? I actually have to really go public with my views and start the network and just stuff like that. What was there a turning point in particular?
I think it was when the dark stories started to come out of the Tavistock. I mean, there was staff at the Tavistock. This is a quote from a Times article about it. There was a dark joke amongst Tavistock staff. Soon there will be no gay people left. There were because they've noticed that virtually all the patients coming through the door, were little gay boys or little lesbians basically. And at that point, I thought, well, surgical gay conversion therapy is going on in and chemical castration is going on in 2015, 2016, and someone needs to say something. So that's probably around that time is when I started.
Right.
Because I was
And
pretty horrified to know it's not what you expect, particularly after, we've been riding so high, right? We'd had the age of consent, it went 18, then it went down to 16, then we had civil partnerships under Blair, then we had gay marriage under Cameron. And then a lot of us, once we got gay marriage, were, great, job done, we can get off the pitch. And this actually is one of the problems, I'm afraid. Lots of people at that point did say job done, and they left Stonewall. And
right.
we took our eye off the ball at that point because Stonewall had, mission fatigue, didn't it? It needed a new mission. And we also were naive. Gay rights is not very old. It's very politically naive as an organization, or sorry, as a philosophy. It doesn't have the hundreds of years that feminism has, for example, to draw, or the 100 or so, whatever it is, in various racial type politics. It doesn't. It's new. It's naive. It was used to being the pariah, and then it enjoyed a moment once everyone had left the pitch with gay marriage where it was riding high. And it was filled with a bunch of non-entities who wouldn't be employed anywhere other than the third sector. And they filled their head with madness, frankly.
I was going to ask you, and I think you've kind of answered it there, but where do you see gay rights now? Because um, 2016 or when Cameron legalized gay marriage, we can say maybe that's the high. Where do you see it now? Maybe going back 20, 30 years ago compared to now? Like, where's if you like the ranking?
Well, it's in a state of collapse at the moment. It's met with absolute disaster. It's got behind this doomed project to say, well, human bodies don't matter very much. Let's get rid of sex in law, despite the fact we are notionally supposed to be for homosexuals and bisexuals and so on. It's in a state of disarray. Stonewall is barely mentioned. It barely tweets. It barely says anything. It's irrelevant. Gay rights in the United Kingdom is quite rightly off licking its wounds, having betrayed its constituency and inflicted disaster and misery and created schism. A schism I wonder if we will ever recover from. I mean, I have to be, there was a time, Senna, when I could go down Soho or something or wherever and be quite happy walking into a gay bar, and, there is these days everyone's okay that you're gay, but there's certainly for men of my age, a few years, middle-aged gay bloke here. You do remember your first time going into a gay bar as a gay bloke. It is the one place where everyone else is like you. Most of the time we're in the minority. That is quite a nice feeling. Stonewall have taken that from me and people like me. I wouldn't go to a pride parade now. I've got no interest in hanging around people who dress up in costumes as furry dogs or whatever in order to have sex. I'm not interested in public fornication, which is very different to the sort of leather queen type stuff. I'm not interested in the elision of gay rights into whatever left-wing issue du jour is. It's Palestine at the moment. It'll be something else in a few years' time. It's in gay rights in this country, I think in the US as well, is in a state of, or the gay rights, mainstream gay rights, is in a state of official and well-deserved collapse and irrelevance. And it's caused misery. It's caused misery in the gay community and caused schism. And who knows if that will ever heal.
I mean, it's just crazy, like you said, to see how far it came, and now if you like the collapse of it, and who is to blame? So, like, obviously, we've got some of the trans activists who have been many misguided. Like I said, the majority of trans activists I've seen or ever met, they're always straight. They're always very limited experience or knowledge on this. But who are some of the like big perpetrators? Who are some of the big, I don't want to say enemies, but some of the big people who've caused this?
Well, you've got the philosophical underpinnings of it. So you've got the postmodernists like Butler and people like that sat in their ivory towers, pontificating about gender identity. And well, they might with their salaried tenure, because they're never going to be the abused, drug-addicted, disadvantaged woman in a prison who has to share a cell with a 6-foot rapist who says he's a woman. So you've got, this came from academia, all of this. So I blame them for being the philosophical motor for it. I've singled out Butler there, but there's plenty more. And there's plenty of blokes, I should add, who have done this. So they're the engine for it. You've then got the political figures who in gay rights who've absolutely failed at their posts. So you've got men like Michael Cashman, Lord Cashman, or Screaming Lord Cashman, as I call him, who is, an inveterate trans activist. Peter Tatchell, an appalling trans activist who says things now that never occurred to him when he was fighting for gay rights. I don't think Peter's ever slept with a woman. I don't know, maybe he has. Then you've got the official gay rights villains of the piece, the people who ran Stonewall. So Cashman was in Stonewall, of course. You've got Nancy Kelly, the CEO of Stonewall. You've got Ruth Hunt, her predecessor. You've got the most recent one, Simon Blake, running Stonewall, who shows no sign of really backing down on this. And then you've got, I think, a cadre of politicians who aid and abet this stuff. And thankfully, we don't have that many of them in the UK compared to other places. But we do have some people you might not expect. I mean, Theresa May was on the verge of bringing in self-identification. So that's a man can, legally back then it would have been, become a woman just on his say-so. And that's a fairly middle-of-the-road One Nation Tory Prime Minister, aided and abetted by the chair of the Women and Equality Select Committee at the time, Maria Miller MP. So these people do come from unexpected places sometimes. You've got some activist politicians, and then you've got a slew of lazy politicians who don't want to cause a fuss, who just go along with it. So the whole of the Green Party, most of the Liberal Democrat Party, who are now finding their feet on this. There's a hell of a lot of Labour MPs, I'm sorry to say, who in private would agree with me, but who in public won't say anything, although they're getting a bit braver now. The Conservative Party actually emerged from this, despite my criticisms of Theresa May and Maria Miller and their scions, and I should say lots of Tory blokes as well. I've named 2 women there, but blokes. I mean, Crispin Blunt and his mates. There is a sort of soft core of them who are to blame. So yeah, I mean, and then you've got the international structure. So you've got WPATH, so the World Professional Association of Transgender Healthcare, which is a collection of ghouls and unscientific fetishists. And Genevieve Gluck from the Redux website did research on these people and found out that some of the people who were writing how you should treat confused little children were members of forums which are unspeakable. I won't describe them, but they were pornographic in nature, and they were what we would call in the Crown Court extreme pornography. for something to be extreme in a criminal court, you know. But if you have a strong stomach, go and look at Genevieve's work at that. So yes, they WPATH and their pals bear a lot of responsibility for this as well. So just off the top of my head, Sunil, those are the people I would isolate for this. And I should say, actually, honourable mention goes to a bunch of celebrities who cheered this on. David Tennant is one of them. I despair of the gay men in media. You know, everyone from Matt Lucas. Well, name a gay man, and most gay men in the media and actors go along with this. Ian McKellen's never said anything about this. You know, Graham Norton, very good example as well.
Yeah.
You know, any one of those gay men had spoken up and said, even moderately, and said, actually, we've got a problem. Or at least it's worth looking at the figures at Tavistock. Something would have changed, but they you know, they wouldn't.
Yeah, even for all those people, how hard it is for them to say, like, you know, we don't completely relate to exactly everything that's going on with the trans LGBTQ movement. There's some direct contradictions and direct negative impact towards the gay lesbian community. So naturally, we can't fully align ourselves to that because there are clear. I don't think it'd be that hard for any of them to say that, but it is worrying. I think the thing that really worries me is the political landscape. I mean, the Green Party right now is scary. They got a leader who's saying the stuff that he's saying, but then the Lib Dems last election, Ed Davey was saying very similar. And these are two. Okay, they're probably not going to be in power, but they're two fairly large political organizations. Labour obviously very split from what I can tell, and Conservatives, as you rightfully mentioned, didn't necessarily do a lot to stop this. So it is quite distressing to see how easy these political organisations have kind of fallen into this trap. Do you see anyone at the moment within UK politics as a strong beacon against?
Yeah, I do. And you know, let's not be too negative about this. The Greens have always had one foot in student politics, and now they've got two. All right, and they're going off, and they're going. You know, they'll take some votes from the Labour Party, but they're deciding to have their silly season now. Sensible Greens like Darren Johnson, who stood to be London Mayor, and the Green Party Women's Group are rightly fighting this, and Shahar Ali has won one case against the Green Party. I suspect he's going to win his next case against them. So there are even within these parties, you know, the Greens are pretty irrelevant, really. They make a lot of noise, they get a lot of airtime. The Lib Dems are beginning to find their feet. There was a trans activist protest at a feminist conference in Brighton this weekend, and the LGBT WTF lol. I can't keep up with the acronym. They keep changing it, Sunil. It's like, you know, the Wi-Fi password. I'm old enough to remember the debates about should we add the B, and now I think, you know, I remember when it was just LG. But now I think maybe we shouldn't have done. Sorry to any bisexuals listening. You know, it just seemed to go to south from there, didn't it? But yes, some Lib Dem MPs have criticised their gay group for siding with the trans activists. And look, let's be honest, the Labour Party is now in a very sensible position about this. Wes Streeting has said very sensible things about it, with the exception of the puberty blockers trial that he's signed up to. But in general terms, he said sensible things. They've said sensible things about the Supreme Court judgment. This poor, loveless landslide permanently in crisis Labour government would like nothing better than this to be out of their tray. They're not rabid trans activists. There's lots of sensible Labour people there. I think Wes Shabana Mahmood is also very sensible on this. I understand Bridget Phillipson's guidance for schools will be broadly sensible, but we shall wait and see. The Conservative Party are obviously in a very good place on this, and have always been in terms of leadership, and that's principally, of course, you know, you can't say that without mentioning the heroic Kemi Badenoch and everything she did in the last Parliament as the Equalities Minister and what she's brought to the leadership. She's always been very good on this issue. So the leadership of the adults in the room, you know, the actual parties, not the populists, is where it needs to be. Reform, who knows? I suppose, you know, my sense is that they'd be solid on this. But then I thought reform would be solid on the assisted dying question, and they were not. So
Yeah.
it's difficult sometimes to gauge the philosophical constellation that holds the Reform Party together outside of the policy on immigration. I don't know them well enough, and I don't know their instincts well enough. But I think there are grounds, excuse me, plenty of grounds for optimism. Do you think British politics has had a post-trans moment? Do you think the Supreme Court judgment is the zenith of the mountain that we had to climb? I think we're now going down the mountain, and we're in a very good place. So there's been some bad stuff, but I think there's lots to take heart because there's lots to be very upset about, and this stuff strikes to the heart of people. And for women's rights, for gay rights, I don't blame people for saying, "Look, it's not over yet. We mustn't be complacent, and we still got to fight." And that is absolutely right. But we must also remember the dark days. And there were dark days where you'd lose your Twitter account for saying, men are not women. I speak as someone who lost mine twice. I said it wrong that day.
Twice from Twitter.
Yes, I was.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
very proud. I'm very proud of it, Sunil. I think I should have 2 medals for it.
It's true. It's true. I mean, it definitely feels like it's a lot more accepting to say stuff about to be critical of you're allowed to criticize some parts of the trans activists and some of their movement. What do you see happening next now when it comes to, I suppose, this whole movement, gay rights? Like, what do you see happening next?
Well, gay rights has a reckoning with itself, and it can either stick its head in the sand and act like this never happened, which I think it might do, or it can actually have an honest discussion. I don't think the mainstream gay rights movement is any longer capable of honest discussion. I think it will be replaced, and I think it will be replaced by the new gay rights movement,
Yeah.
which, of course, in this country comes from principally the LGBT Alliance, lesbian project, and I like to think for the here and there by the Gay Men's Network with the bits and pieces we do. Although I emphasise we don't want to be the next Stonewall, but I think the LGBT Alliance do, and I think they do a damn good job of it. So I think that will change. In respect to the broader perspectives, it's not completely over. We've still got nutters, frankly, in the NHS, in education, in trade unions that we need to sort out. I think the private sector is getting its house in order rapidly, frankly. The death of DEI, which is very well documented by Tanya de Grimwald in all the work she does and is a real expert on this, is quite convincing. That'll be slower. That'll cascade through. And as the Supreme Court judgment is sequentially applied across policy areas, we will see stuff, I think, coming back into line. And that may be a slow process for some areas. Sex Matters are still bringing a couple of judicial reviews at the moment. There's these ponds in North London where they've got women's, men's, and mixed, and they still want to let men who say that they're women into the women's pond, and Sex Matters are still having to do a judicial review. I think we will have a little bit of that, but what we are doing now is a clean-up operation. It's not fighting the central battle, and I think that is a change. I think that is a difference, because as I think I tweeted in the past, we now have a Supreme Court judgment. You lot have a date with reality, and you can postpone it and adjourn it as much as you like. But that judgment's not getting overturned, and no minister is going to stick their neck on the line and say we want to amend the Equality Act. No one from the Labour Party is going to do it. No one from the Tory Party is going to do it. So it'll be a painful clean-up, but we've got to clean up. I think we're well over the tipping point, and as you say, people certainly feel more capacity now to openly criticise. And so there was a point where me saying, I think, and not just me, and by no means just me, and I wasn't the first to say it by any stretch of the imagination. Sue Evans and Marcus Evans from the Tavistock were the first really to say this, and Dr. David Bell and Sonia Appleby and people like that. But there was a time when simply saying this looks like gay conversion therapy would get you cancelled and job loss and thrown off Twitter and all the rest of it. People do now raise that criticism widely, and I think there is a wide acceptance now that accepting a 12, 13-year-old self-diagnosis and chemically castrating them is a very, very strange thing to be doing when we're trying to look after children who are confused.
Couldn't agree more. You alluded with the assisted dying bill. What was your take on all of that? Being a lawyer and understanding this probably a bit better than some of us, what was your take on that bill?
I thought it was an appalling bill. I thought it was drafted on the back of a cigarette packet. It was one of the worst drafted pieces of law I've ever seen. I think it's a dangerous piece of legislation, and I think the concerns that were raised as to mental capacity and to the plight of vulnerable people were just ignored.
Yeah.
And I'm very, very fearful of that. I don't think it will pass the Lords because of the sterling work the Lords are doing. But I think it's a terrifying piece of legislation, which very much like gender ideology reduces the individual human being to a sort of consumer articulating a customer is always right demand, which then are never divorced from the surrounding circumstances. There were no protections in the bill and no safeguards really for any sign of undue influence. It was a charter for anyone who wanted to exploit anyone who was elderly, who changed a will the night before.
Yeah.
The tribunals that Kim Ledbetter wanted to set up wouldn't even have a power to look at a will. So I thought it was a disgraceful piece of legislation. I thought the evidence that was frankly disregarded from disability rights groups who was disgraceful. I thought the way Chelsea Roff's evidence on eating disorders was disregarded was disgraceful. I thought the way Professor Alan House's evidence on the Mental Capacity Act was disregarded was disgraceful, because he pointed out that the Mental Capacity Act has never been used to assess someone saying, I want to die. Because, as our national advisor on suicide prevention, Professor Lewis Appleby, says, when people say, I want to die, I want to commit suicide, our normal policy response is to say, we're going to try and stop you doing that, and we're going to try and understand why you're saying that, and understand whether you might be depressed because you just had a terminal illness diagnosis. Suicidal ideation spikes in the first, I think, 6 weeks after a terminal illness diagnosis, but then it abates. If you speak to someone about 10 weeks after, most people don't feel suicidal. They've come to terms with it. So that the Mental Capacity Act was not designed for people saying they wanted to die. But we have, just like in gender, we have this transactional approach, this consumerist approach that, well, my body, I know what's right for my body. And look, there is a clear philosophical line between gender and trans activism, because gender simply says we will measure the aesthetics of children and young adults against the aesthetics of pornography. And if they don't measure up to that, so they're not, quote, real boys or real girls, we'll medically fix them. And once the body becomes a commodity philosophically, which is what it is there, well, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to say there are some commodities that are so bad you throw them away.
Yeah.
And it's no surprise to me at all that very same people that support gender support assisted dying. Why wouldn't they? It's the same bare bones consumerist transactional model that doesn't really care about vulnerability. It doesn't really care about detransitioners. It doesn't really care about people subject to undue influence and so on. It plays a good game of saying it does care, but it doesn't. Just look at Canada, where they're offering medical assistance in dying to schizophrenic or homeless boys.
I mean, I just think you kind of alluded to it there, but for me personally, I just think it's a sign of people just not valuing human life anymore, and I think it's really, really sad. Like, and there's a real sadness when you're seeing people just devalue human life, and I think that's really a horrible, horrible place in society. I'm not particularly religious, but still, I just think that's just a really sad state of where we're at. And I wanted to touch base with you on Canada's one of the reasons I brought this up. I mean, what is going on in Canada is pretty shocking and should worry anyone in the West. And how that's been, I don't know, legalized or able to happen is absolutely
Well,
terrifying.
the latest thing in Canada with the proponents of this law, because it always starts with just 6 months to live or whatever it is. It always starts like that. Then the categories get broader and broader and broader as things as conceptualized as to rights, and we have this reductionist discourse in the West that everything's a right, a right to my gender identity, a right to die, and so on. And once you use the reductionist intellectual currency of rights, you permit rights arguments.
Yeah.
So people say, well, why do they have a right? Why are you discriminating against anorexic girls? And of course, it's not discrimination. It's, well, we currently have the Court of Protection authorizing force feeding, which are very difficult cases, and no judge wants to make that judgment. But, I recall a beautiful judgment, where a very concerned judge said, look, this poor young woman doesn't see any value in her life, but I do, and I hope that she does one day. And the latest thing we've got in Canada now is them trying to expand it to, quote, mature minors. So that means people who are under 18. This is just the same philosophy as gender. People who are under 18 who have a settled wish to die. And the idea that you do that and conceptualize it as a rights debate, or divorce it from a safeguarding, I hate that term because it doesn't really cover the human horror of what's going on, but divorce it from just the reality of a very young person being killed. And then I understand they're all, organ donors. They don't have an organ donor problem in Canada now because people are being culled. This is dystopian. And as you've said, Sunil, you don't have to be religious to look around and say, well, this is just the sort of thing that makes society just incrementally a little bit more miserable.
Definitely.
And just that little bit more unpleasant to be in. Because as was movingly said in the House of Lords, it's very clear that the message that is going to be sent is that some human lives are worth more than others.
Definitely.
And who's going to be the person saying, no, you shouldn't feel like a burden? So yeah, it's appalling. But look, this is where we are at the end of the aesthetic revolution. This is where we are at the end of consumerism.
No, it's really interesting talking to you, Dan. So I wish we could talk about this for longer. Just yeah, it's I think it's a scary time in terms of that debate. It's good to see the pushback in terms of when it comes to gay
Yeah.
rights and the trans stuff, and that's something that should be really optimistic about going forward. I have a closing thing that we do on the show where we ask you for an unpopular opinion that you think should be popular. So anything we discussed or something completely different, but yeah, an unpopular opinion you have that you think should be popular.
My unpopular opinion that I think should be popular is that Kemi Badenoch and Sir Keir Starmer are the adults in the room, and you should give them a chance, and you shouldn't listen to populists like Farage and Polanski. And whatever Keir Starmer's faults, and no matter how bad he is at government, there is a core of him that is trying to be decent and is trying to do the right thing. And he shouldn't just be written off as the great Satan. On the other side of the house, Kemi Badenoch has shown that she is thinking not just about governing, but she's thinking about how you govern. And she's thinking very seriously about what a Conservative government would look like, but she's making deeper points about the fetters on government, whether it's the Human Rights Act, whether you agree with that policy or not, but more broadly, things like the shadow state. So my unpopular opinion is that Kemi and Keir are the adults in the room, and that people should give them a second chance before they listen to the barroom bores, who it's very easy to sit at the end of the bar, on whether you're on the left wing or the right wing, and say everything's going to the dogs, everything's wrong. And those people should be treated with caution, because if you think they have all the answers or have the first clue as to what they would do in government, I would ask you just look closely at that claim.
Interesting. Oh, Dennis, it's
Yeah.
been amazing speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Lovely to meet you, Senna. Take care, and thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.